Welcome in, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Always.
Okay, good. Because today we're digging into something pretty substantial. Mandate for leadership. The conservative promise.
Ah, yes. This one's a doozy.
It really is. It's not just some think tank's wish list. It's a detailed set of policy recommendations. A framework, really, for a potential conservative administration in 2025.
It's like a sneak peek into how the authors of this document see the world and how they'd govern if given the chance.
Exactly. And you know we love to unpack this kind of stuff. So we've got the roadmap. Let's see where it takes us.
Let's dive in.
First up, their assessment of America's current state. And they don't hold back, saying America is in decline, blaming the political establishment and cultural elites. They even go so far as to say America is in a, quote, cold civil war.
Strong words for sure.
Yeah.
And they don't stop there.
Definitely not. They make a really interesting point, saying that this decline, as they see it, is intrinsically linked to what they call a family crisis.
Right, and this is where their view of government's role really comes into focus. They're not just talking about addressing symptoms, they want to use federal power to actually strengthen what they call, quote, family formation, authority, and cohesion.
It's a pretty hands-on approach. They argue that tax policy should favor families, and single-parent households should be getting less government assistance than two-parent households.
Right, and that's been a consistent theme in conservative policy for a while now, but they take it a step further, like adding work requirements back to food stamps. That's a move sure to spark some debate.
No doubt. It'll be interesting to see how those proposals are received by the public, especially with the election coming up. But before we get too deep into the domestic policy weeds, let's shift gears to the global stage, specifically China. This document identifies China as America's biggest threat.
And they're pretty blunt about it. They say China is, quote, the top priority for U.S. defense planning.
It's a pretty clear signal of where they see the biggest challenges, and it really sets the stage for their national security agenda. They argue that past administrations were too soft on China, and it allowed them to become more powerful, putting America at a disadvantage.
There's a real sense of urgency in their tone when they talk about China. They argue that the U.S. needs to take a much more assertive posture, both militarily and economically, to counter China's growing influence.
And that means, in their view, more defense spending. They argue that America needs to modernize and expand its nuclear arsenal to deter China, and they even suggest developing what they call an Article X for China, reminiscent of Cold War containment policies.
It's a pretty significant escalation compared to how previous administrations have approached the U.S.-China relationship. And it's not just about military might. They're also calling for a major industrial policy shift, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. and encouraging allies to do the same, directly challenging China's economic dominance.
Yeah, it's a pretty clear America First approach, but with a global twist. They want to strengthen alliances, but only if those alliances serve American interests. Now, before we dive into how they plan to shake up specific government agencies, let's talk about their overall view of the federal government itself.
Well, they're not exactly fans of big government. They argue that the federal bureaucracy is bloated and inefficient, often working against the interests of the American people, and even at times against the president.
So their solution.
You guessed it, a smaller, more efficient government.
But what does that look like in practice?
They're talking about streamlined hiring practices, maybe even revisiting how civil service exams impact hiring. They believe the current system allows for what they call bureaucratic bloat, and they want to trim the fat, so to speak.
So less government, but also a different kind of government, one more directly accountable to a conservative president.
Exactly.
It's a pretty bold vision, and it'll be interesting to see how they plan to make it a reality. But we'll save that discussion for our next deep dive session.
Sounds like a plan. So, ready to dive into the trenches of government agencies.
Let's do it. Where do we start?
Right at the front lines, the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS. This document does not mince words, calling it bloated, bureaucratic, and expensive, claiming it's lost sight of its core mission:
And what do they see as its core mission?
border security and immigration enforcement.
Two hot-button issues for sure. How do they propose to tackle them?
They want to hit the reset button on DHS refocus, downsize, and shift resources away from what they consider non-essential functions, moving more towards border security. Think more boots on the ground.
So less bureaucracy, more direct action.
Exactly. And on immigration, they want tighter enforcement, a system that prioritizes, in their words, lawful immigration.
Which likely means a tougher stance on illegal immigration.
Right. They also want to streamline the whole immigration system, potentially consolidating different parts of it under DHS, a more centralized approach.
From securing the homeland to navigating the world stage, the document then turns to the Department of State. What's their take?
It's clear they see the State Department as an extension of the president's foreign policy vision, which they believe has been, well, let's just say lacking.
And their vision is?
A much more assertive, strategically focused State Department, one that prioritizes American interests first and foremost. They want people in those positions, from ambassadors to lower-level officials, to be fully aligned with that worldview, actively pushing those interests on the global stage.
Okay, so a more ideologically driven State Department, at least from their perspective.
You could say that. And this extends to how they view treaties and international agreements. They're calling for a pause on negotiations, a reevaluation of existing agreements. They even go so far as to say the U.S. should stop enforcing any treaty that hasn't been ratified by the Senate.
Which is, let's face it, a pretty controversial stance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It challenges how international agreements are traditionally viewed, but again, it reflects their emphasis on a strong executive branch. And this focus on asserting American power globally is a recurring theme.
Speaking of power, let's talk about the intelligence community. They call for greater efficiency, less duplication of effort, all while stressing stronger congressional oversight. How do they reconcile those two things?
It's a balancing act for sure. They believe a more centralized intelligence apparatus is necessary to navigate the complexities of the 21st century. They want to give more power to the Director of National Intelligence to coordinate between different agencies, streamline things.
Makes sense. But how does that square with greater congressional oversight?
They argue that transparency and accountability are essential to ensure these agencies are operating within the law, serving the best interests of the American people, not going rogue, so to speak.
So a tighter leash, but from a different direction.
Precisely. And this emphasis on aligning intelligence activities with a conservative president's worldview is clear in their proposal for a 60-day review of all covert actions.
Basically, a way to ensure everything aligns with the new administration's priorities. Now, from covert ops to the airwaves, this document doesn't hold back on its critique of how information is disseminated, specifically through the U.S. Agency for Global Media.
They really take aim at Voice of America, accusing it of straying from its mission of promoting freedom and democracy.
And they don't stop there. They even claim that Voice of America has, at times, aired propaganda from foreign adversaries.
It's a pretty serious accusation.
It is, and it highlights their concern that these entities are not promoting American values effectively. They essentially want to hit the reset button, ensure this agency is aligned with their vision.
And part of that vision involves giving the State Department more oversight over Voice of America, essentially arguing that the State Department, with its expertise in public diplomacy, might be better suited for the job.
So again, more control, a tighter leash.
Right. And speaking of control, let's talk about USA and foreign aid in general.
Ah, yes, another perennial hot topic. What's their take?
They argue that U.S. foreign aid should be used strategically to advance American interests and values, not just given out freely. They're particularly critical of how they see aid being used to advance what they perceive as a liberal agenda.
Can you give an example?
Sure. They call for the reinstatement of the Mexico City policy, which prohibits U.S. funding for organizations that provide abortion services or referrals.
Also known as the global gag rule.
Exactly. And they want to close any loopholes that allow for exceptions, making it clear that they intend to use the full weight of U.S. foreign policy to advance their agenda.
From foreign aid to something a bit closer to home, let's talk about the Department of Agriculture.
Or the USDA, as it's known in government circles. They see a department that's become too bloated, too bureaucratic, too interfering in the agricultural sector.
So, less government intervention in farming? What does that look like?
Think scaling back regulations, promoting free market solutions. They want to reduce subsidies, reform the crop insurance program, and they take aim at specific programs like the sugar program, which they argue distorts the market and drives up prices.
So, a more hands-off approach.
Yeah.
Letting market forces dictate things.
Exactly. And this theme of reducing government dependence extends to their views on food stamps. Remember those work requirements we talked about earlier? They're back.
Right. The argument being that it reduces abuse and incentivizes people to find work.
Exactly. Now, from the farm to the classroom, the document then sets its sights on education.
Always a big one. What's their vision for the Department of Education?
In a nutshell, they want to see a system that prioritizes school choice, local control, and what they call traditional values.
Sounds like a pretty significant departure from the current system.
It is. They believe that parents should have more control over their children's education and that the federal government should play a much smaller role.
So more power to the states.
Exactly, and to parents. They're big proponents of school choice programs, including vouchers that would allow parents to use public funds to send their children to private schools.
A move that's sure to be controversial.
No doubt. It's been a long-standing debate in education reform, and their vision doesn't stop there. They also want to review current federal education standards.
What does that mean exactly?
They're concerned about what they see as inappropriate or ideologically driven material in school curriculums, particularly on issues related to race, gender, and sexuality.
So a shift towards what they consider a more traditional approach to education.
You could say that, and it's not just about K-12. They also have their sights set on higher education.
Oh boy, this should be good. What's their take on colleges and universities?
They're concerned about rising college costs, which they blame on a bloated and inefficient system. They argue that federal aid programs should be more focused on helping students graduate with degrees that lead to good-paying jobs, not what they consider frivolous or impractical fields of study.
So a more utilitarian approach to higher education.
That's one way to put it. They want to see students equipped with the skills they need to succeed in the workforce, and they're not afraid to use the power of the purse strings to steer them in that direction.
From the classroom to, well, everywhere. Let's talk energy.
Ah, yes, the Department of Energy. They envision a conservative energy policy that prioritizes American energy independence, reduces costs, and, no surprise, promotes economic growth.
And how do they propose to achieve that?
By taking a more hands-off approach, of course, they argue that the government shouldn't pick winners and losers when it comes to energy sources, whether it's fossil fuels, nuclear, or renewables. They believe in letting market forces determine the most efficient and cost-effective energy mix.
But isn't that a bit of a contradiction? They want energy independence, which often requires government intervention and investment.
That's a fair point. But they argue that the best way to achieve energy independence is not through government mandates or subsidies, but by unleashing the power of the free market. They believe that a lighter regulatory touch will lead to more innovation, more competition, and ultimately lower energy prices for everyone.
Okay, so less regulation is a key part of their energy strategy.
Absolutely. They want to roll back what they see as burdensome regulations on the energy industry, particularly those related to climate change. They see those as job killers that stifle economic growth without providing any real environmental benefits.
So a more skeptical view of climate change and the need for government action.
You could say that they're more focused on energy production and economic growth, viewing those as higher priorities than addressing climate change. And this emphasis on deregulation extends to their views on the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA.
The EPA, always at the center of the environmental debate. What's their take?
They argue that the EPA has become too powerful, too bureaucratic, too quick to impose costly regulations on businesses without considering the economic impact.
So a more business-friendly EPA.
Essentially, yes. They want to see a more balanced approach to environmental protection, one that takes into account the needs of both the environment and the economy.
Sounds like a tough needle to thread.
It is, and it's a debate that's been going on for decades. But they believe it's possible to protect the environment while also promoting economic growth, and that the EPA has gone too far in one direction at the expense of the other.
From the environment to our personal health, let's turn to the Department of Health and Human Services.
HHS, a massive department with a huge impact on the lives of everyday Americans. And this document makes it clear they see a need for a significant course correction
And what's the desired direction?
towards a system that prioritizes individual responsibility, free markets, and, unsurprisingly, a pro-life agenda.
Okay, let's unpack that. What does a more market-driven healthcare system look like in their view?
Think allowing individuals to purchase health insurance across state lines, expanding health savings accounts, reforming medical malpractice laws, essentially putting more power in the hands of consumers and less in the hands of the government.
And what about the Affordable Care Act?
They want to repeal it. They argue that it's been a failure, driving up costs, reducing choice, and expanding the role of government in healthcare.
A stance that's in line with long-standing conservative opposition to the ACA.
But they're not just talking about undoing past policies, they're also laying out a clear pro-life agenda.
Right, and they're not mincing words. They call for a ban on abortion, defunding Planned Parenthood issues that are sure to ignite fierce debate.
It's a stark reminder that this document isn't just about policy tweaks, it's about advancing a specific set of values.
Exactly. They're not shying away from the social and cultural implications of their agenda, and they're making it clear they intend to use the levers of government to advance those values.
From healthcare to housing, what's their vision for the Department of Housing and Urban Development? They want to see a HUD that prioritizes individual responsibility, promotes homeownership, and reduces government dependency.
So a less generous safety net, a greater emphasis on self-reliance.
Essentially, yes. They believe that the best way to help people is to empower them to help themselves.
How does that translate into specific policy proposals?
They call for reducing HUD programs and spending, arguing that many are ineffective and create disincentives to work. They want to see a more targeted approach to housing assistance, one focused on helping people achieve self-sufficiency, not trapping them in a cycle of dependence.
It's a vision that sees a smaller role for government in addressing social problems, a greater emphasis on individual initiative and responsibility.
Exactly. And this philosophy extends to their views on fair housing as well. They're critical of what they see as discriminatory policies like affirmative action, arguing that they promote a colorblind approach to fair housing.
Which likely means focusing on enforcing existing fair housing laws, but not going beyond that to address systemic inequalities.
Right. They believe that everyone should have an equal opportunity to succeed, but that the government shouldn't be in the business of giving preferential treatment to certain groups. Now, let's move on from the concrete jungle to the great outdoors.
Time to talk about the Department of the Interior. What's their vision for managing America's vast natural resources and public lands?
They emphasize striking a balance between conservation and economic development, particularly when it comes to energy production. They believe that our public lands should be used to benefit the economy, not just preserved as pristine wilderness.
A more utilitarian approach, then.
You could say that. They want to see these lands used for multiple purposes, including logging, mining, and energy extraction, activities they believe can create jobs and boost the economy.
So less emphasis on conservation, more on resource extraction.
It's not that black and white. They argue that they support conservation, but that it shouldn't come at the expense of economic growth.
And they're not just talking about changing how these lands are used, they also want to reform the Interior Department itself.
Right. They argue that it's become too bureaucratic, too beholden to environmental groups, and too focused on regulation rather than promoting economic development. They want to see a more efficient, transparent, and accountable Interior Department, one that is responsive to the needs of all stakeholders, including those in the energy and timber industries, not just environmentalists.
From the great outdoors to the halls of justice, what's their vision for the Department of Justice?
They call for a return to what they see as the core principles of the justice system: fairness, impartiality, the rule of law.
Sounds pretty straightforward. What's the catch?
Well, they believe that the current administration has politicized the DOJ, using it to target political opponents and advance a liberal agenda. They want to depoliticize the department, restore what they see as a commitment to equal justice under the law.
So a less activist DOJ, more focused on law enforcement, and less on social justice issues.
Essentially, yes. They're also concerned about what they see as rising crime rates and a general breakdown of law and order. They advocate for tougher enforcement of criminal laws, stricter sentencing guidelines, and greater support for law enforcement.
It's a vision of a justice system that prioritizes punishment over rehabilitation, deterrence over understanding the root causes of crime.
You could say that. They see a direct link between what they view as lenient policies and rising crime rates, and this emphasis on law and order extends to their views on immigration as well.
Which likely means stricter border security, tougher enforcement of immigration laws.
Exactly. They want to reduce illegal immigration, and they see a strong Department of Justice as key to that goal. Now, from the courtroom to the boardroom, let's talk about the Department of Commerce.
What's their vision for this department?
They want to see a commerce department that prioritizes free markets, limited government, and a level playing field for American businesses.
Okay, so far so good.
Mm.
But what does that mean in practice?
In their view, it means reducing regulations on businesses, promoting free trade, and taking a tough stance against unfair trade practices by countries like China.
So, a more hands-off approach to the economy, letting businesses thrive without government interference.
Precisely. They believe that the private sector is the engine of economic growth and that the government should get out of the way and let businesses do what they do best: create jobs and innovate.
And what about trade? They mentioned taking a tough stance on unfair trade practices.
Right. They believe in free trade, but they also believe it needs to be fair trade. They're particularly concerned about China, which they accuse of stealing American jobs and intellectual property through unfair trade practices.
So a more confrontational approach to China on trade.
You could say that. They believe that the U.S. needs to stand up for its economic interests, even if it means imposing tariffs or taking other measures that could lead to a trade war.
From trade to the nation's finances, let's turn our attention to the Department of the Treasury.
Ah, yes, the keepers of the nation's purse strings. They see a need for a conservative Treasury Department that prioritizes fiscal responsibility, economic growth, and sound monetary policy.
Sounds like a pretty standard conservative economic platform so far. What are their specific priorities?
They're laser focused on reducing government spending, cutting taxes, and balancing the budget. They argue that the national debt is a major threat to the economy and that the government needs to get its fiscal house in order.
So a familiar refrain from conservatives, less government spending, lower taxes. What's their rationale?
They believe that tax cuts will stimulate economic growth, leading to more jobs, higher wages, and ultimately more tax revenue, even at lower rates.
It's the classic supply-side argument. But they're not just focused on taxes and spending. They also have some strong opinions about the Federal Reserve.
Right. They believe that the Fed has become too powerful, too unaccountable, and too willing to manipulate the money supply, leading to inflation and other economic problems.
So they want to rein in the Fed's power. How do they propose to do that?
They throw out a few ideas, including auditing the Fed, limiting its ability to create money, and even returning to a gold standard.
Some pretty radical ideas there, at least by today's standards. It'll be interesting to see if they pursue those if given the chance. From the high-stakes world of finance, let's turn our attention to an agency that plays a critical role in supporting the backbone of the American economy, small businesses.
The Small Business Administration, or SBA, they see an agency that's become too bureaucratic, too bogged down in red tape, hindering rather than helping small businesses.
So what's their solution?
Unsurprisingly, they want to streamline the SBA, reduce regulations, and make it easier for small businesses to access capital. They see small businesses as the engine of job creation and want to unleash their potential by getting the government out of the way.
Makes sense. But how do they propose to make it easier for small businesses to get the funding they need?
They talk about streamlining loan programs, cutting red tape, and making it easier for small businesses to navigate the often complex world of government regulations.
From small business loans to the global marketplace, let's talk trade.
They believe in free trade, but they also believe that it needs to be fair trade. They argue that the U.S. has been taken advantage of by other countries, particularly China, and they want to see a more aggressive approach to trade negotiations.
So a more America-first approach to trade.
Exactly. They're willing to use tariffs and other measures to protect American jobs and businesses, even if it means risking a trade war.
It's a more protectionist stance than we've seen from some previous administrations. But it reflects a growing sentiment among some segments of the American public that globalization hasn't been entirely beneficial. Now let's shift gears one last time and talk about independent regulatory agencies.
Ah, yes, those quasi-governmental entities that wield so much power over the U.S. economy.
Exactly. We're talking about agencies like the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, and many others.
And their stance on these agencies is pretty clear. They believe that they've become too big, too powerful, and too intrusive, stifling innovation and economic growth with a tidal wave of regulations.
So their solution.
Unsurprisingly, they want to rein them in, reduce their power, and limit their reach.
But these agencies were created for a reason, weren't they? To protect consumers, ensure fair competition, safeguard the financial system.
That's true, but this document argues that they've strayed too far from their original mandates, becoming captured by special interests and beholden to an outdated regulatory mindset. They believe that a lighter touch is needed, one that allows businesses to innovate and compete without being stifled by excessive regulation.
It's a classic debate, the balance between regulation and free markets. And it's one that's likely to continue for many years to come.
You know, we've gone through a lot, agency by agency, proposal by proposal. It's a lot to digest.
It really is. And it's easy to get lost in the weeds, but I think it's important to step back for a second and look at the bigger picture here.
Absolutely.
Because this document, it's not just a laundry list of policy ideas.
It's a statement.
Exactly. It's a statement of values, a vision for what the authors believe America should be.
At its core, it's about individual liberty, limited government, They believe that the government shouldn't be in the business of telling people how to live their lives.
And that individuals and families should have more freedom to make their own choices, whether it's about healthcare, education, or how they run their businesses.
Exactly. And this emphasis on individual liberty, it plays out in their economic vision as well.
Right, they're all about free markets.
They argue that the private sector is the real engine of economic growth, not government programs. They want to unleash the power of the free market by reducing taxes, regulations, and government spending.
But it's not a completely hands-off approach. They're not advocating for some kind of Wild West economy,
No, they still see a role for government, but it's a limited role.
like a referee.
Yeah, ensuring fair competition, protecting property rights, enforcing contracts. But they believe the government should intervene in the economy only when absolutely necessary.
Okay, so it's about finding that balance between individual freedom and the need for some government oversight.
Exactly. And this theme of a strong, assertive America, it extends to their views on national security as well.
Definitely. They're not shying away from projecting American power on the world stage.
They believe in peace through strength. They want a strong military. They want to stand up to adversaries like China and Russia. And they're not afraid to use force if they believe American interests are at stake.
It's a pretty stark contrast to what they see as the more hesitant, maybe even apologetic foreign policy of recent years.
They believe that America has a duty to lead in the world. And that requires a willingness to use all elements of American power: military, economic, diplomatic.
It's a vision that some will find inspiring, others might find alarming, but it's a vision that's rooted in a deep belief in American exceptionalism.
And it's a vision that's shared by a significant portion of the American electorate. Whether you agree with it or not, it's a vision that's likely to have a major impact on American politics for years to come.
Absolutely. And that's why we do these deep dives, to equip you, our listeners, with the knowledge and context you need to make sense of these complex issues.
Because ultimately, it's up to each of us as citizens to engage in the political process and decide what kind of future we want for our country.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And one final thought. This document explicitly states that the American Republic was founded on principles prioritizing and maximizing individuals' rights to live their best life or to enjoy what the framers called the blessings of liberty. Does this vision of government, with its calls for a smaller federal bureaucracy, a more muscular foreign policy, and a greater emphasis on traditional values, align with that founding principle? We'll leave you to ponder that. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.